Hello, everybody, and welcome back into yet another video on world history. Today, we're going to be talking about nationalism, specifically in Europe. Now, while nationalism is something that has taken place in multiple parts of the world and in multiple chapters in history, we're going to be focused about basically this very small chapter in Europe during the 1800s today. Now, here's the thing, is that during 1800s Europe, we see that there's this philosophy clash with basically what politics is supposed to look like through the 1800s. You have the conservative group that still is made up of a lot of nobles, wealthy property owners. These are your kind of lords, uh, marquee, all those individuals in different places throughout Europe. They want to keep the status quo. Things are working pretty well for them. Why would you want to change it? They want the traditional monarchies basically to stay the way they are. You have liberals at the time. And again, when we use these terms, we're not using them in a modern political sense. We're using them to describe different types of feelings on a political spectrum. The middle class was mainly the type of people that were the liberals of their time, that they were business leaders and merchants. They were the people that were kind of growing during this time as business really starts to expand during the Industrial Revolution. And they feel that there should be elected parliaments, that the people should have a say, but only certain people. They felt that property owners, people that owned land, they should be the ones that vote. That the general populace, they should not probably get to vote. And then on the far end of this extreme for the 1800s, you have these people that are radical, right? Again, this sounds silly in the 2020s, but these radical people were arguing for these crazy ideas, these drastic changes where everybody gets to vote, that everybody gets certain civil liberties, you get equality, and that there's a brotherhood, right? Or this kind of fraternity, this family feel within a country, that you have national unity in a democratic system. Again, doesn't sound that crazy from the perspective of someone living in the 21st century, but back in the 1800s, this was kind of like an out there idea for people. Nonetheless, we see that nationalism is something that starts to develop during this time. And nationalism basically is this belief that people's greatest loyalty, it belongs to a nation. It belongs to basically a place and a culture as opposed to a ruler, okay? And what this looks like is usually it's a bond that's formed over a common culture or a common history. This is often associated with very, very intense patriotism. And again, this is shaped in a bunch of different ways, but kind of comes together in what we call a nation state. A nation state is a geographic term that's combining two things together. A nation is basically a group of people with a common culture and history, and a state that is a political entity that controls its territory and its government affairs. What that can also look like is a nation state is basically a place that has a shared culture, a shared history, shared language, shared territory, nationality, even a religion in some cases, right? These are all factors that can make up a nation state. In 1815, though, we really only have a few places that we could describe as nation states. Spain, England, France are really the only nation states in Europe at this point. That there are these areas that they share a religion, they share a common history and language and culture, and that they live within a territory or fixed set of borders moving forward, that their land has been theirs for a decent period of time. What we see though is that there's other places in Europe that are these larger empires, that are multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious in some cases. Austria-Hungary is an example of one of these large empires, but you also have areas that share kind of common land, territory, and language and culture, but are basically locally fractured. And these are places like Germany and Italy. One of the best ways that we can look at this with this idea of nationalism versus the conservative power of monarchy, one of the first that breaks away are the Greeks. Now, the Ottoman Empire, in these videos, we haven't talked too much about the Ottomans, but the Ottomans rule over a big swath of territory stretching from Southeast Europe into Southwest Asia. Their empire was huge, it was multi ethnic, and it was based out of what's present day Turkey. But the Ottoman Empire controlled much of the Balkan Peninsula, including Greece as we know it today. One of the big things that we see is that there's conflict over religion. Why? Because the Ottoman Empire was an Islamic empire, and Greece, at this point in time, as it is today, is a primarily Eastern Orthodox, so a uh, Christian territory. What this means is that there's a lot of conflict over religion, and there's not really a shared national identity between the Ottomans and the Greeks. And because of this, we see that they want to break away. And with the help of France, uh, Britain, and Russia, that support allows for Greece to become independent. Now, the Greeks aren't the only ones to be able to break away. In 1830, Belgium is able to declare independence from the Dutch, again, separating out what was the United uh, Kingdom of the Netherlands into what is still the Netherlands and Belgium. We also see attempts at uprises in other places. 1848 is a big year in European politics because you have places like Italy and Hungary. The Czechs also try to break away and form their own independent nations at this time. The problem is that a lot of these revolutions are very intellectual. You have people that, for instance, with Italy, you have thinkers and writers like people like Giuseppe Mazzini that are arguing for Italian unity or this Italian unification that he calls Risorgimento, and that this idea was basically to try to put Italy back together. While these ideas have value, there's not a ton of substance or oomph, any sort of like political or military power behind this, and that basically all these places, the revolutions fail, and by 1849, they've returned to a more conservative monarchy, or they're still controlled by these larger monarchies outside of their control. France, if you can imagine, we're still talking about France and their kind of political conflicts as well. By 1830, we see that the king of the time, Charles the 10th, he actually tries to reinstitute absolutism, that he wants to move away from the constitutional monarchy back to full absolute power to the king. As you can imagine, this doesn't go over terribly well in France, and he's actually replaced for a more liberal monarch named Louis Philippe. And Louis Philippe rules for a good 18 years before the mob kind of turns on him as well. They decide, hey, we promise we're done with the monarchy this time for good. And they institute another republic. This is called the Third Republic. For those of you that counting at home, in total, there are 5 republics in France. The most recent started in 1958. What we see though is that basically the mob rule, instead of moving in the direction of radicals like it did during the Jacobins during the French Revolution, we see that the citizens choose more moderate leadership at this point. And in 1848, December of that year, Louis Napoleon, yes, related to that Napoleon, is elected president. He declares himself emperor, though, about 4 years later, which is actually welcomed. Why? Because it provides stability for the people of France. Now, here's the thing. You might be saying to yourself, hey, why is it that all these countries are still struggling uh, between trying to figure out if they're monarchies or republics at this point in time? And again, I would point out that this goes back to the Congress of Vienna, that in that document, or in that meeting rather, we see that the reforms that are put in place and the building that takes place around Europe, it's really focused on trying to maintain the status quo. While the leaders of those countries want to maintain the status quo, the people of these countries uh, don't necessarily want to maintain that status quo. And that's where we really start to see this friction during this time and nationalism really start to build. Russia is no exception to the rule here. In fact, Russia is probably one of the more backward countries, if you will, during this time. They're still feudal, again, that they are an agrarian society. They have a feudal or medieval hierarchy still in place. In fact, they still have serfs, which are effectively um, slaves, and the nobles have unlimited power over them. And the czars, the kings of Russia, are essentially very reluctant to free them. Why? Because the landowning nobles that give them and basically allow the czars to stay in power, they don't want to lose their serfs, that they like having these people that are tied to the land. The Crimean War, though, shuffles this up. The Crimean War in 1856 is fought and Russia loses it. That's the big thing that you need to take away from this when we're talking about reform during this time. Tsar Alexander II, he moves towards modernizing Russia at this point and decides that the best way to go about this is to try to basically redistribute farmland to the peasants. The nobles get half of the farmland, while everybody else gets the other half. And while this is wholly inequitable, we also see that this is something that's very difficult. Why? Because they didn't get the land for free. They got the land uh, after for a price, and they had 49 years to pay it back. So they essentially were debted landholders, that they own land, but they basically all that they were spending and making was going back towards paying this land off. So while they were free in theory, they really were not economically free in Russia. And again, this is something that's going to continue and is something to consider as we go and we talk more about Russian history in future videos. Now, while we can talk about that, we also have to talk about the case studies of unification. While some of these efforts to modernize are either kind of half measures or fall apart, Italy and Germany are two examples of unification that we can see in Europe during this time. Italy before this is not what we think about as Italy today. Italy essentially was all these different smaller kingdoms and states that you had the Papal State, you had Venetia, you had Tuscany, you had the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. The largest and most powerful of these kingdoms or states was Piedmont, Sardinia, the Kingdom of Sardinia. And it was ruled over by Victor Emmanuel II. His prime minister at the time was Camillo Cavour, and Cavour is a huge figure in trying to push for this idea of unification. While the Italians failed in 1848 to unify, Cavour realizes that the reason that they're going to struggle to unify is because of the Austrians. And if Austria continues to block unification, they need the help of another major power in Europe. So they call on the French and they say, hey, look, we need your help to make sure that we can unite the Italian peninsula. And with the help of France, they're able to win in this conflict against the Austrians, and they're able to unite most of northern Italy. In the south, though, you still have the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies that is ruled over by a monarchy at this point. And this is a big stumbling block. Despite this, you do have Italian nationalists in the south. And they're led mainly by this individual named Giuseppe Garibaldi. And Garibaldi is a kind of war hero, this swashbuckling gentleman with a big beard, and he commands people known as the red shirts, that he would wear red shirts into battle, and his followers would do the same. He's able to take over the kingdoms of Naples and Sicily and turn them over to Victor Emmanuel II. effectively unifying most of Italy with the exception of Venice and Rome. Venice is ceded from the Austrians when the war with them is finally over in 1866, as well as by 1870, the Italian forces march on the Papal States towards Rome to forcibly join Rome into Italy. The Pope refuses to work with the government, even though he's still in the Vatican, and actually declares himself a prisoner of the Italian government in the Vatican at this time, even though he was free to leave. Germany is a somewhat similar story, but again looks different in other ways as well. Central Europe was still very kind of ethnically similar. That a lot of these smaller parts of the German Confederation, they were very similar. They had sort of kind of a shared history, in some cases, a shared language and religion. And what we see is that the mainly Germanic population of Prussia really starts to push this idea of unifying uh, Germany or one Germany as a thing. And the reason that this happens again is that they're mainly a Germanic population, so it's easy to unify the population. It was also a very, very strong army, the strongest in Central Europe at the time. The king, King Wilhelm I, he appoints Otto von Bismarck as the chancellor, or what would be like the prime minister of Prussia. And Bismarck is a conservative. He's a landowner owner from Prussia, and is known for what's his style of politics, this realpolitik of basically trying to meet political policy with realism instead of idealism. So instead of trying to come up with these lofty goals, hey, this is what's going on in the here and now, and this is what realistically can get done. And basically, what Bismarck says is that, hey, you know what? The revolutions that people tried to put in place in the 1840s, they didn't work because they were just ideas, that we need blood and iron to actually forge a Germany together. And he basically starts to rule without any sort of checks on his power. The king basically gives him the blessing and says, hey, you can rule without a budget or consent of parliament, and that is what Bismarck does. In 1864, Prussia and Austria, they decide to ally together actually, and they take two border states up near from Denmark in the north. The Austrians actually, though, declare war on Prussia soon after that, and they lose, but they also lose territory. So Schleswig and Holstein become territories of Prussia, or what will become Germany. Then in 1867, with the northern provinces of Germany united, Bismarck tries to basically create these incidents, these small little conflict areas, um, to try to unite the north and south of Germany together. Why? Well, the north was mainly um, Protestant. The south was still very heavily Catholic area, and basically the feeling was that the south might not be willing to join together with the north unless provoked, and that's what happens. Is that South Germany and North Germany, they unite to fight the French because Bismarck basically poked them, and it created these incidents to the point where France declares war on Prussia and the German Confederation. By 1871, Germany had beaten France and they're officially unified as one nation. We see Wilhelm, instead of being king of Prussia, he becomes the emperor of Germany, or the Kaiser of the Second Reich, or the Second Empire of Germany. The first empire being that of the Holy Roman Empire. So, as you can see, as we move through this period of nationalism, that the kind of modern boundaries of the state start to put themselves together in Europe. And the map is kind of taking shape here. As we move closer to modernity, things start to look very similar as Germany and Italy become these unified nations in Europe. Again, we're still dealing, though, during the 1800s with this conflict of nationalism, uh, how government fits with the role of the people moving forward. And these are still going to be themes that move forward throughout the history when we talk about Europe. So, again, thank you for listening and hope you found this video informative.